Thank you, Arvid. It's a pleasure to welcome Max Boykoff this afternoon. I keep saying morning because I haven't eaten lunch yet. Max is a professor in the Environmental Studies Department, where he now serves as chair at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He is also a fellow in the Cooperative Institute of Research in Environmental Sciences. Among his ongoing work, Max was a contributing author to the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on mitigation and policy action that was released on April 4. And he has also been an advisor on the Don't Look Up film project. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Max Boykoff. You're greeted by thunderous applause, but you can't hear it because we're all muted.
Thank you, Steve. That's a very kind introduction. And thank you, Arvid and Krista as well. And thank you to Felicia Martinez, who can't be here, who I know, and we work together here and there. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm going to navigate a certain pathway through my prepared remarks, but I certainly welcome your comments and questions at the end. That's the fun part for me. So as I deliver on my obligation to present to all of you, I just start with the notion that we all know things are not what they used to be, right? And so we can understand this in a variety of ways through our experiences, through the way in which we're viscerally picking up on that, but the way in which climate change has been brought into our discussions from the late 1980s has been through the science, particularly as a pollution problem. So I can give you many examples of why things aren't the way they used to be through scientific pathways of understanding. For instance, it's been 800,000 years since CO2 or methane levels have been this high. CO2 levels are about 50% higher than around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Can point to ongoing records being set and sea level rise and rising faster and faster in certain places. And last summer, we can look to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data set to find that the June, July, August period was the hottest on record in the continental US. We've seen actually across the planet that consistently we've been breaking records in terms of the hottest years on record, where the 7 warmest years since record keeping began about 140 some years ago have been the last 7 years, and 19 of the last 20 have occurred since 2000. So not surprisingly, this was the hottest decade on record. I can go on and on with many of these factoids about how things are not the way they used to be. However, the scientific ways of engagement don't reach everyone. And so the premise that I have here is that we need to open up multiple pathways in order to meet people where they are as a way to increase engagement and action on climate change. Climate change is one of the most prominent and existential challenges of this 21st century. Climate change is not a single issue, not something that you can choose to debate or not debate, as the Democratic committee had decided in the last presidential election. Climate change is an intersectional set of challenges. It's a threat multiplier. It weaves through many other critical issues, such as foreign policy, as we've seen with the invasion in Ukraine. It weaves its way through immigration, as we've seen, through poverty and inequality, where some people who are at the forefront of climate impacts are those that have contributed pretty much nothing to the climate challenges. And we can think about it through public health. I could give you more and more examples there too, but essentially, climate change is a collective action problem. This is not an individualized, atomized set of challenges. This is a consequence of our shared behaviors that cut to the heart of how we collectively live, work, play, pray, and relax in today's society. And as such, finding common ground with each other across the political spectrum, across physical spaces from urban to rural and so forth and so on are critical for successful, sustainable, and enduring climate change engagement and action that's needed. All that said, climate communications and our discussions with each other are often stuck. And what happens is there is a climate silence where, people feel the partisanship, the politicization, the polarization, and they just don't want to talk about some of these challenges as it gets mapped down, particularly here in the United States, onto political spectrum. Friends at Yale and George Mason University have been tracking, among many other things, public polling on how people talk about climate change, where they're getting their information, and so forth. And they have found that up to today, only about 35% of US American adults talk about climate change with their family and friends occasionally. And they actually have these climate opinion maps that I highly recommend that you take a look at if you haven't seen them before, where you can scale down to your own county. Here in Boulder, we have a high concentration of researchers on climate change, and we are at about 47% that fit that description. So under these circumstances, there's just an essential question: how can we creatively and effectively overcome climate silence and spark productive conversations as pathways to action across the political spectrum? And that's where I center my remarks today. I'll focus in on some examples that I pulled from a book that I've written a few years ago, and mention some other projects that can help us animate and really think about that question: how can we creatively and effectively spark productive conversations as pathways to action? So I return, if I may, to some slides here. There are these dominant scientific ways of knowing that I mentioned. People make links between formal science and policy in their everyday lives through a range of relevant media, person-to-person communications and experiences, right? Few people are picking up these reports. These reports nonetheless remain influential in policy decision-making, in shaping the way in which collectively this is addressed. But these are admittedly largely natural physical science pathways to knowing. And with that, we run this risk of developing what's been called the information deficit model. And Brian Wynn, who's a science and technology studies scholar, has framed it in this way: that the deficit model is dead, but long live the deficit model. All the way back from the 1950s and 60s, the deficit model of communication, which is essentially to say that people don't do the right thing or don't make the right choices because of a deficit of information about that thing. That's what the deficit model is. So if we just pile up more and more reports on the desk of influential leaders, if you put these on the kitchen table of your uncle or your grandmother, and you just inundate them with information, they're gonna do the right thing. So this logic is, you may just already think that on its face it is flawed, but people fall into this trap all the time because people doing this work think that people are ignorant or ill-informed, and that their ignorance is then blamed for a lack of support for action based on scientific evidence, or scientist training, frankly, results in a belief that if we just put out more information in this rational way, this rational actor will then make the right decisions. But we all know that we actually violate this on a daily, hourly basis. We're complicated, we're complex people who often do many irrational things. And so with that in mind, we need to be thinking more creatively and effectively about how we can overcome this deficit model, but then still contend with the need for passing and sharing information. And so really this is what I say, that there was this 20th century model of communication that often subscribe to this notion that if we just dumb down the science, people will get it and do the right thing. What I argue here is that we actually turn it on its head, that instead of the dumbing down process, we actually need to be smartening up. And so we need to rely on a lot of research that's been done in these areas now of social sciences and humanities scholarship to better understand what works, how, when, and why, under what circumstances. And so I'll get to that. But one additional quote here is from Suzanne Mosier, who's a really respected and accomplished social scientist who has pointed out that providing information and filling knowledge gaps is rarely sufficient to create active behavioral engagement. And on top of that, I add sustained behavioral engagement. So the information deficit model is dead, but it lurks. And it is this trap for some of us just to keep pumping out reports. And as Steve had mentioned, I contributed to this most recent assessment report that is the small one to the right on this screen that I'll talk about a little bit more in just a second, because it is important. There is value here. And you may notice that Brian Wynn is playing off of this old adage when Charles VI died and was replaced by Charles VII, that there's this notion that despite that one thing, belief, concept, idea, or notion is dead, another immediately rises to continue with the similar ordering. And so we need to step out of that similar ordering so that we can raise the scale of our engagement to meet the scale of the challenges we face today. So there is value to these reports, at least I really hope so, because I, as a contributing author, committed a considerable amount of time and energy into this. I was one of, there's a central lead authors pool of about 300 people, and an additional layer that I was involved in of another 300, over 600 authors reviewing over 18,000 peer-reviewed articles to put this together. And I was brought in to write about media coverage of climate change and how that influences public attitudes and intentions and beliefs and behaviors, as I'll talk a little bit more about. I also was brought in to bring in considerations of what are obstructions to more coherent and significant climate action, and focused in on contrarian counter movements that can be linked to carbon-based industry interests and what's called at times dark money. And so I made those contributions, and it definitely generated media attention. Those elements of what I had contributed to the technical summary and also to a chapter 13 in this full report that actually all told is nearly 3,000 pages. It actually puts in the record, though, these additional layers that tells a fuller story of a changing climate, not just the natural physical dimensions, but also moving then into the social sciences and humanities. And so some of what I'll talk about here, one of the examples that I'm going to focus in on with you all today on comedy and humor as a pathway to meet people where they are and open up these passages, actually is in that IPCC report. And so the progression of the IPCC of bringing in new voices and bringing in additional elements of a changing climate, I think still contributes to the value that it brings and the attention that it brings to these critical challenges. So moving forward then, what I'm getting at is that we as researchers, practitioners, as everyday people, must enlarge the considerations of how knowledge can influence our actions through experiential, through emotional, visceral, tactile, affective, and aesthetic ways of knowing and learning about climate change. Bringing in the arts and increasingly partnering the sciences with arts in different ways to produce greater engagement. And so I just provide some examples of public demonstrations and protest signs or signs that can help bring out these partnerships or even some of the contradictions within which we're living, as a way to just provide for you other pathways that people have found to then enter into these spaces, that one need not carry an advanced degree in related sciences to still have a perspective that matters. So people can come into this through a variety of pathways. This last picture here, the one up now, is youth climate activists that have increasingly entered into these spaces and provided their important voices through Fridays for the Future and youth climate strikes to demonstrate that we need to bring in many different voices here. And medical doctors, for instance, have staged a protest die-in outside JP Morgan offices in London not too long ago, last fall, where they highlighted the ongoing fossil fuel investments and the ways in which that continues to perpetuate the emissions that contribute to a changing climate. And so when we look at these together, we look at the last Conference of Parties meetings in Glasgow, where people took to the streets here in this picture. We can see what Rush Holt succinctly says here is that facts by themselves are voiceless. His expanded comment, though, that I want to read to you is that he said in this moment, he said, there's nothing philosophically incompatible with science and politics, but there seem to be psychological hurdles that scientists have to overcome. The ethic in the profession is that you stick to your science. And if you're interested in how science affects public policy or public questions, just let the facts speak for themselves. Of course, there's a fallacy there too. And then he says facts by themselves are voiceless. And so again, moving from that 20th century communications model into the 21st century and bringing in these, opening up our registers of ways of engaging, ways of giving voice to these challenges and to our concerns as well as our ambitions. And so this kind of thing has been called at times exemplification theory, where concrete cases of influential actors grappling with issues like climate change can significantly influence people's awareness and their inclination to act themselves, or as you just might call it, infectious. You make something like this more infectious to engage with. So I wrote this book, Creative Climate Communications, where I try to capture a lot of what I mentioned earlier of what works, how, when, why, under what conditions, and try to put together essentially a handbook to help us, guide us to understand there's not going to be any silver bullet. There's not going to be the one way that gets everybody engaged, that there have to be these multiple different pathways for a very complex and variegated audience of public citizenry, that we're all different and we find different approaches appealing over others. And so the reason that I have the word climate in parentheses here is for two essential reasons. I wrote it in a way that I think that it can provide insights and transferable guidelines and rules for other scientific, political, cultural, and societal issues. Examples of that are vaccinations, right? Or vaccine hesitancy, as we've seen lately with the terrible coronavirus pandemic. This can be transferable, I think, to considerations around nuclear power, around genetically modified organisms, around stem cell research. Second, the reason that climate is in parentheses, importantly, that fundamentally, when we're talking about climate change, we may not always want to invoke it explicitly, to have effective conversations and exchanges. That nowadays that can put up one's defenses depending on who we're speaking with. So we can enter into these conversations more creatively and ultimately effectively by talking about this in terms of resilience, in terms of stewardship, in terms of legacy, in terms of local air and water quality. Some of the examples I gave before, like public health and national security, energy security, patriotism, can be these pathways into having more productive discussions with one another. There are examples of this throughout the literature that I bring into this book and document work of others, including that, for instance, of Matt Goldberg, who had looked at how Christian engagement with climate change, those of a Christian faith, sometimes framing it as protecting God's creation, can engage a sector of Christianity that otherwise may not be as engaged. That's just one example. So I say that, this is not to shy away from the issue the issues associated with climate change by any means, but we also shouldn't be tone deaf about what might be most effective in certain contexts. Because if we want to ultimately engage and inspire each other to talk about and take action on climate change, we may blunt or undermine our communication goals if we're always insisting on leading with climate change. And so it's a lot easier to derail or muddy the waters of public understanding than it is to keep them productive and clean or on the rails. But we need to be very systematic and mindful as we move forward. And so this book had sought to do that. I'll give you just one example. A chapter in the book is about different ways of learning and knowing, and really focusing in on that affective notion. So that affective notion, emotional way of engaging can span a range from despair and doom and gloom and concern, of course, but also across to, what inspires us? What are our ambitions? What do we hope for in the future? And within these spaces, we can play with and experiment with comedy as a mechanism to explore that emotional register. And so I've been working through a project here called Inside the Greenhouse with co-directors Beth Osnes, who's a theater professor, Rebecca Safran, who's an ecology and evolutionary biology professor, and Phaedra Pizzulo, who's a communication professor. We've been experimenting on a variety of creative communication endeavors, but Beth Osnes, as a theater professor, and I have specifically really focused in on comedy and climate change. We've been experimenting with our students for the past 7 years, and concurrently, we've actually been holding an international video competition, which you're all eligible for, 2 minutes or less. The entry window closed, and I'll talk about it a little bit more here in a moment. Had a big show nearly a month ago now, and released it that you can watch on our Climate Comedy YouTube channel if you're interested. But really, this experiment is a way, an effort to expand into these other ways that engages, for instance, with student populations. We found this to be very successful. In fact, we've been doing research then as we then carry out, we had live shows, and in the pandemic, we moved into an online spaces. I'll talk about more here shortly, but we've also researched what we've been up to. And we found that this has been largely successful. We and increasingly many others across the social sciences and humanities have been studying the effectiveness of comedy and humor to engage new audiences. And so we've been finding this very effective with our students. We have also been surveying audience members and people who watch the videos. We've been using a variety of methodologies in order to understand and critically assess the success or lack thereof of this kind of work. But we've been finding that a lot of power flows through comedy. It enables this movement between authorized, common considerations and revealed alternatives that concede fertile locations for additional dimensions of understanding these challenges. And this is particularly important with younger audiences that we've focused in on here. Beth Osnes, who's standing next to me, who you may see up here on stage in the slide, she has really worked on this notion of there's a whole range of different comedic approaches too. Satire is very popular, but she's focused in on this idea of good-natured comedy. And this is a way for us to focus with our students where we have them tether their comedic content to one of many solutions, ways to address climate change. And we use the book Drawdown Solutions that you may be familiar with, which has 100 solutions that are from the individual to the collective. And Beth has had us hone in on how we can enrich climate communication through good-natured comedy, which is this way of talking about our shared challenges, of talking about contradictions within which we live. So there isn't actually one person that we're punching up or down at, but we're talking about how there are many ways in which we can face this together. And it's proven to be a very powerful and useful, productive way of approaching these challenges. I'll spare you a lot of the theory that sits within the paper on the left in political geography, unless there are any Michel Foucault aficionados out there. But basically, I'm sticking to the kind of practicalities of it for now. And we've then, I think, gotten better in our experimentation, and we've had to adjust just like everybody else in the world in the last few years with the pandemic. We had a pandemic edition last year. And so what we did in lieu of a live show, we actually were able to hire underemployed comedians that weren't able to get out into the venues. And we actually worked with pairing our students with comedians and developing just veritable writers' rooms. So the top picture you can see are some of the students along with some of the writers. We actually had some writers that have written for Stephen Colbert, Late Night with Stephen Colbert, for Saturday Night Live, and many others. The photo down below is our sort of production cast. You can see the talent that we had on our poster last year. And the person there, Chuck Nice, you can see some of his activities, but he's also co-host of Star Talk with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he has been involved in science and comedy for a very long time. And he's proven to be a really great partner for us. Beth, who's come in from theater, who's studied cultures of comedy, history of comedy and performance. And then the top left there is a producer, Sean Andres, who's been wonderful to work with. And so we've put together these shows, now the pandemic edition, with working with our students last year. And then this year, we were able to break out a little bit more. And we had what we called the Coast to Coast edition. We had shows in New York City in the East Village, April 14th. We had a show in Los Angeles before that in Santa Monica, 3rd Street Promenade. We had another show in DC. And then we had our Boulder show, Friday, April 15th. And as you can see, just one still shot from it. Several students chose to do stand-up comedy. Others chose to do skits. And I don't believe it was a super spreader event because many of us who were there continued to test negative. But the theater that we had was standing room only. It was just lively. Students had all their friends there. It was like a real comedy club, and students did an amazing, wonderful job. And so what we did then is we compiled the best of the best. We had to make some difficult choices, and we put it into this Earth Day online show. And I think if you just even scan that QR code with your device now, you can go to it. Otherwise, you can go to our YouTube Climate Comedy channel. And I invite you to watch it. It's just over an hour. And we keep experimenting. And you be the judge of it, of course. You know, while comedy can provide relief and anxiety, may provide relief amid anxiety-producing evidence, and it can be this kind of emotional salve for coping, it also serves to bridge really difficult topics and overcome polarized discussions in entertaining and non-threatening ways, right? We can see this across a range of other challenges. We see Trevor Noah roasting the president of the United States last Saturday night, and also many members of the media in an effective way of this way to bridge these difficult topics, because these are really serious times. And we are very careful not to risk trivializing critically important challenges. We tread really carefully as we consider the politics of everyday life relative to comedy and climate change. But we recognize the social function and the value of humor and comedy as this way of opening up these spaces of licensed transgression, if you will, where we can walk this tightrope between sites of subversion and sites of sedation to productively open up spaces, and also to provide spaces of empowerment and self-determination for our students to find their own voices. And that can be radical in the sense of getting down to the root, and they often come out feeling much more as though they can discuss many of the heavily burdensome topics that they've been studying and find their voices. And so through this research, through these experiments, we've been finding that this enhances awareness. It sparks conversations. It influences us emotionally in positive ways, and it also enhances engagement. So with this work, we now have gotten foundation funding where we're going bigger and bigger, and we're hoping that we're now funding seed grants in other universities for people to hold shows and experiment as well, and showing that both context and content matter, that the humorists as claims makers and their messages as claims matter. It's not just simply making people laugh, but it's also delivering climate messages. It's a challenge. It's decidedly an incomplete project, but it's one that we continue to work on. So again, I'd be interested later if you watch the show and let us know what you think. Some of our Boulder acts are at the very end of it, but it's ongoing work in progress. So with the book, I didn't want to just leave you with just this idea that it's complicated. Through all of this, I really pulled it together to give us some guidance. And in short, these are rules of the road and features of a roadmap that help us understand how authenticity matters, that we can sniff out phoniness in a moment, but you have to be authentic with the people, building up relations of trust that help enhance productive conversations that can lead to action. We need to be aware of different audiences. We need to make sure we're accurate. We understand what it is we're communicating. That also helps foster and maintain relations of trust. We need to be imaginative and bold through these creative and hopefully ultimately effective ways of communicating in the 21st century. In terms of features of a roadmap, it's been very successful where we're working to find common ground. There's always a time and place to name and shame and blame and villainize, but ultimately we need to find common ground in this collective action problem, as I've said before. Also, which since I wrote this book, I think we've actually collectively been steering a conversation much more capably into the here and now. Back, not that long ago, there was often discussions of, what we're aiming for in 2050, 2100. There's images of polar bears on distant icebergs. But now, increasingly in the last years, we really have been seeing where it is here and now. In New Mexico, the wildfires with links to a changing climate is the here and now for many of you. We experienced this right here in Boulder for several weeks, different fires. And one wasn't even a wildfire, it was a firestorm through a neighborhood, the Marshall Fire. Those are carefully linked through attribution science to a changing climate that brings it into our immediacy, that can be also sparking motivation, so to speak. Focusing in on the benefits of engagement as well. The ways in which we can link, not just that by engaging with climate change helps us address one of the most prominent and existential intersectional challenges of the 21st century, we can also come together as communities. We can feel connected. We can find our place. We can have fun. That's important. And in so doing, the notion of self-determination is very important, that people can feel as though they're empowered, where we can create these spaces for them to share their experiences, to share their perspectives, as I hope to hear from each of you as I wrap up my prepared remarks. And to finish it up, just so that we can smarten up these communications, that there's a lot of ways in which we can certainly talk at each other. I mean, I've been demonstrating that to you, but we need to be speaking with one another. We need to be listening to others' perspectives. I'll say a few more words on that. These are some of the projects that I'm involved in. Here, the Creative Climate Communication and Behavior Change Center was launched just recently. Co-directors Phaedra Pizzulo and Leif Van Boven. Phaedra's in communication, Leif is in psychology and behavioral science. And so we have then put several projects under this umbrella to approach these things in different ways. I've focused in more on one of our initiatives within Inside the Greenhouse. Also, I'm leading this project, the Colorado Local Science Engagement Network, which is more focused in on policy. And then the Media and Climate Change Observatory is to the right, that I'll say a few more words about here now. And basically, that's a project that tracks over 125 sources across newspapers, television, and radio in nearly 60 countries in 13 different languages around the world. And this has grown to be a network across the universities that you can see below. There's about 24 of us that provide these updates. We just posted our updates yesterday on our website of the ebbs and flows at different country profiles. And we make all of our data open access. We partnered with our university libraries. They're forerunners in providing open access data sets. We still have digital object identifiers for people to cite it, for us to track how it's being used. But you can go to our website and you can download the data. You can also download, we have two different figures that accompany each data set that we update every month, along with summaries. And I'm still finishing writing this last month's summary that'll appear there soon. But with 3 to 4 others, we write a summary to talk about what are the large themes in terms of really 5 categories: political, economic, cultural, ecological or meteorological, and then the final one is around, what did I say? Political, economic, cultural, ecological or meteorological, and scientific. After all that focus on the science. So the scientific dimension. So for instance, the write-up, the summary that I'm finishing up with the others, is really focused in on the third working group report that I talked about, that I was a contributing author to. And that drove a lot of the media attention in the month of April. So we have those accompanying reports. These are one of the figures that I talk about that you can download is in a variety of, from JPEG, PDF, vector images to use. And you can also zoom in their interactive features to get a closer look at media coverage. When there was increasing media coverage, when there were different increases and decreases. Happy to talk about that as we went forward. Media attention was pretty high in 2021. It was the highest amount of media coverage across the year that we found since our monitoring began 18 years ago at a global level. We have it tracking back to 2000 in several of our country level sources. And so it's really there to provide a foundation for us to do research from it. And that's a lot of the research. Some of this work is actually also in that IPCC report because it provides this way to put our finger on the pulse of the ebbs and flows of coverage. It's been useful. It's been used in a variety of policy circumstances. It's been presented on the floor of the Senate, for instance, by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island to talk about how climate change is not being prioritized as it should, and so forth and so on. So we hope that it provides a useful resource within this kind of work that I do. Creative climate communication, hopefully, as Arvid mentioned, for a better world. That's my ambition with this. And it's a lot of collective work. So there's more figures here. We can then use that to show, just for instance, print media coverage in September 2020 versus print media coverage in September 2021. You may notice Trump looming large in 2020, and I did not make that orange on purpose. And then Trump largely disappearing in 2021. I think he was ranked second in terms of word association with any news coverage of climate change or global warming in 2020, and then 72nd in 2021. And so we're able to track that and then provide these sorts of word clouds, which is about word frequencies, on our website, in our summaries, and in other places that we then bridge it to research that we do. So we've been publishing a lot of our own research. We're happy to see other people using it because, frankly, a lot more needs to be done than we can do ourselves. And so we've had an ongoing partnership where we've published in the Lancet Medical Journal about how media coverage of climate change and public health, we can start to track that. We've examined it as it relates to coronavirus media coverage in a piece that we wrote for Lancet Planetary Health, actually. And then on the right is a piece that we wrote that came out recently in the Open Access Environmental Research Letters that looks at specifically how human contributions to climate change have been covered. We looked across these 5 English language media, media sources in 5 English language, predominantly English language countries. And we had a lot of results that I'm throwing at you like spaghetti on a wall, but I'm going to focus in on one here, which I pulled from the top left, in that we tracked this coverage across and found that the good news is that 90% of coverage from 2005 to 2019 was seen to be accurate. We had a large coding team. This was a development that was good news. However, when we broke it down by source across these years, we broke it down in several other ways, but you can see that there's more accurate outlets and there's less accurate outlets. And so while we found that the Toronto Star, the Guardian Observer, Globe and Mail got things accurately much more, we actually found that Canada's National Post, Australia's Daily Telegraph and Sunday Telegraph, the UK Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday, which are considered historically conservative outlets, were significantly less accurate. And some of those are Rupert Murdoch-owned News Corps outlets. And so there's more that can be done to dig into how are we letting this lens of political partisanship or political positioning then feed into the media coverage itself. And so this is still ongoing work that we and others are doing. So, you know, as I reach a conclusion here, I've been asked to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. You know, again, things are not what they used to be. And do our responses to date meet the scale of the challenges associated with 21st century climate change? The short answer is no. But can we create better futures? And the answer I give you is emphatically yes. More and more work is being done that gives me, I think, some realistic hope that we can move towards better futures. But going back to tethering it to scientific ways of knowing again, the latest cooler than average month across the planet was in December 1984. So that means that if anybody was born, if you're 37 years old or younger, if you just turned 37 or you're younger than that, you've never had that experience, not as though you can get a sense of it, but things are not what they used to be, especially for younger people, that we are living in a new abnormal. And so, there is some doom and gloom associated with that. But the good news is that we can make change every hour, every day, every month of our lives through the food that we choose to eat, the clothing we buy and wear, the ways in which we travel. And so that is a source for each and every one of us to find agency. And so to leave you with a few practical takeaways, talking about climate change, engaging, listening to others' perspectives, and having conversations and dialogues is critically important. And don't just stop there. We need to scale up. So join groups like this group here that provides a forum for you all to have discussions. Amplify your voices and your perspectives. And we need to work for systemic change. That is not radical. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, at the release of our report in early April, had said that that is what is needed. He had some very powerful things to say that I can dig up in the discussion if you'd like me to share more about that. But he's talking about decarbonization on the horizon. We need to radically change our energy systems. And that doesn't happen on its own. It requires multi-scale, from individual to collective struggles along with sustained endeavors. Essentially, things are made. They're not just found, and they aren't just going to be the way they are. We need to unmake them. We need to make them differently in order to align with a better future for this world. So I thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope the contributions that I've made and that of what I've shared with you has helped this discussion productively. There's certainly a lot more work to do, but I will stop sharing my screen and I'll welcome your comments and questions from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. A very thought-provoking presentation. I see that Arvid has